Oh, hi there, Mama. It's Jolene Russell. Well, I'm doing just fine, Mama. I'm actually doing a podcast right now. I know. It's so interesting because I'm getting asked so many questions about my life. But I really relate to Jolene because when when I became religious, I just so much was so new. Like, how am I supposed to know that you wash your hands for bread and you can't talk? It takes one light, right? It takes one light to light up the darkness, and we all have that light within ourselves. For me, it took me until I was in my early 50s to see my light.
Welcome to Ordinary People with Extraordinary Stories. I'm Chana Weisberg, host of this podcast. Joining me today, we have an extraordinary individual. Her name is Julie Rothschild Levy, and she has an unusual position. She is a Jewish content comic creator, which will tell us a lot about what that means. But basically, it makes people laugh a lot. So I was very intrigued to hear from Julie a lot about her story. She has an interesting story. She's originally all the way from Minnesota and now has made Aliyah with her family and lives in Israel, where she tries to make people laugh despite the hardships of what we are going through. Welcome, Julie. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Hannah.
This is going to be fun. So tell us a little about how your story began. I know you have an interesting journey towards Judaism, a very interesting journey towards comedy and humor and using humor in a positive way in our lives. So just take it away.
Okay, so it starts back in the 1900s when I was born. Um, so I was actually born in Baltimore, Maryland, and my parents moved to Minnesota when I was a baby.
Mm,
My father worked for General Mills, and that's why they made the big shift out there.
mhm.
So I grew up without family around me. I saw them maybe once or twice a year, and I grew up
You mean like extended family?
exactly like
Yeah.
grandparents, cousins, aunts, and
Right.
uncles. So we were
Hmm.
pretty isolated in Minnesota. And I grew up mainly in the suburbs until I was about 9 years old. Then we moved to the city of Minneapolis. And I have a younger sister and a younger brother. So I'm the oldest. And we just lived a very comfortable life in Minneapolis. I went to public schools. We were Reform growing up. So I went to a Reform temple. That became a very big part of my life once I hit high school. And until then, I was often the only Jewish kid in my class in my public
Mm.
school. And wow, okay, so then after when I got to high school, like I said, I got very involved in my synagogue and very
What
involved.
does that mean? Like what were you involved with and why were you so involved?
I was so involved because we did musicals.
Mm.
And the first time I performed, I was in sixth grade. It was my school's production of Cinderella. And I got Cinderella. So that was very, very exciting. And it was like a whole new world opened up to me. It was an operetta. So I sang and I got dressed up, and my mother did my makeup, and it was very exciting. And then in high school, when I was in my youth movement, it was more than just the performing, but the performing was the icing on the cake. So we also did musicals, and a lot of them were musical comedies, which I found out I absolutely loved.
Interesting.
So, yeah,
So
I
you were
really
always a performer. You were always out there performing. I mean, or you discovered it or pretty young that you were
discovered it, but I
right.
didn't always do it. There was a period
Do
of
it.
about 20 years of my life where I didn't do anything, and we'll get
Mm.
there.
Mhm,
So,
okay.
in high school, I'm performing and I'm excited. Then I go to college, and I was involved in a campus TV, like, comedy show. Okay, so a bunch of kids and the college where I went to, Ithaca College in upstate New York, was very oriented on communications, television, radio. And I was like, this is for sure what I want to do. And after my second year, we had to declare a major. And I thought, hmm, I don't really know if I want to do this.
Hmm.
I don't really know if I want to be here. So I
Hmm.
decided to transfer. And I found myself having a year. And I did not grow up in a Zionist home. But all of a sudden, I had these friends who had been to Israel, and they said, "Why don't you go?" So I was like, okay, now this is before Birthright. There weren't a lot of programs for kids my age. At this point, I'm 20 years old. But I went to a kibbutz in northern Israel, and this is 1989-90. So the kibbutz was still very much in its socialist heydays. Okay,
Mhm.
and it changed my life.
Hmm.
Changed my life because
In what way?
yeah,
Yeah.
I became a Zionist, and
Oh, okay.
I just knew somehow my life would involve Israel. When I left Israel after being here for 9 months, I took two ulpans, which is like an intensive Hebrew learning program, and I really had changed. I was like, everything's Israel, 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 and I transferred to the University of Wisconsin Madison. And I'm so grateful that I went to university not now. Like, meaning back in those days, it was right around the time the peace talks were happening with the Palestinians and the Jordanians. So Israel, even though we got some flack, it was really like the sweetheart of
Mm,
the Middle East. I would put it that
mhm,
way. And I got very involved in Israel politics on campus. And we put together the Israel Independence Day parade. And I just knew this was going to be my life. I wasn't 100% sure I was going to live there, but somehow I was going to be involved in Israel advocacy.
mhm,
We're jumping a little bit from performing to the Israel part. I did do some performing in Israel, actually. There was an English, well, there still is an English speaking theater troupe. Now, at this point, I'm not religious yet either. So I was performing with men and singing and all of that. And then I met my husband, well, actually, you know what? Let me back up. I'm sorry. After I graduated, really, after I graduated, I moved to Washington, D.C. I worked for the American Jewish Committee, and then I got a job at the Israeli Embassy in Washington, which was a wonderful experience. I was an assistant to the counselor for interreligious affairs, which basically meant that we were the liaison between the Israeli government and the Christian communities in
mhm,
the United States. Now, here I am, I'm doing research on the various Christian communities. I have a Reform background. I don't even really know that much about my own religion in depth, but I certainly knew a lot about the Christian communities and was able to guide, let's say, the consulars in different cities in the US how to approach a priest versus a minister versus what have you. And this was the time when the peace talks were going on. So I also had the privilege, really, of being on the staff for then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin
mm,
and Foreign Minister Shimon Peres when they had come to Washington to sign the peace talks, or the peace agreements, I should say, peace agreements
mm.
with
Right.
the Palestinians and then with Jordan. So
Mhm,
that was very interesting to have like a behind the scenes of that time period. And I
mhm.
was very liberal. I was very left wing. I was like, yay, peace. I grew up in Minnesota. What do I know?
Right.
When
So
Rabin was, Mhm.
I'm curious about how this, liberal woman who was very involved and so many, successful in her career and all, did you find that there was something missing in your life? Like, what brought you to Judaism?
So as a child, going back, I was a bit embarrassed to be Jewish. Not that anybody gave me any problems. I really did not experience anti Semitism. But as a kid, I didn't want to be different from everybody
Mhm,
else. And I remember, I think I was in fifth grade, and the teacher knew I was Jewish. And he said, Julie, why don't you tell us about Hanukkah? And all eyes were on me. And I wanted
mhm,
the floor to open so I could drop down and disappear. I
mm,
was so embarrassed. And my best friend growing up was Catholic, and I often accompanied her to church. And that was just, nobody thought anything odd about it. Sometimes she'd come to
mhm,
temple with me, I'd go to church with her. It wasn't until I was a little bit older, my grandmother, who had survived the Holocaust, was a proud Jew, not a religious woman, but a proud Jew, and that really had an impact on me. So when I went to Israel and when I got involved in the Israeli government, etc., she was so happy. She was just
Mm.
so proud, and she gave a lot of money to Israeli institutions. And we didn't become religious, and I say we because it was along with my husband. My husband
Mhm.
is Israeli, and we
Mhm.
met here in Israel. We got married and we moved to the US. We moved actually back to Minnesota. We started a family. And when our second child was born, when he was about 2 years old, we decided to put him in a Chabad kindergarten, like a gan.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, we were deciding, okay, we have an older son and my husband. We're not cutting my son's hair, the 2-year-old. We're going to have an upsharon, which is a ceremonial cutting
Mm.
ceremony when the boy is 3 years old, and he's going to wear tzitzis. He's going to wear a kippah, yarmulke, and that was a big turning point because everybody shifted their look. All of a sudden, the kippah and the tzitzis and everything is coming out.
So why was he gonna wear that? Just because of that's the school that he went to?
So my husband actually had when we moved to the States, it was very hard for him.
Mhm.
He was very, very proud Israeli, and he wanted to connect somehow. So he met a Chabad rabbi, and he asked him, "Have you ever heard of Tanya?" Rabbi's like, "Yeah, I've heard of it." So they started to learn, and nothing happened for about a year. It was just a nice part of his week. And then we started to meet religious Jews and we started to get invited to Shabbat dinners. And sort of slowly,
Mm.
things started to change. And I think the icing on the cake was really that physical change
Mm.
that my husband and my sons took upon themselves.
Mhm.
And there's definitely a Jewish community in Minneapolis. There is a religious community in Minneapolis. At the time we were in St. Paul, there was a small Chabad community. And but it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. I wasn't covering my
What
hair.
was hard for you? What was hard for you, and what were the
So it was
challenges that
hard
you faced?
because y- my family wasn't terribly excited about the changes 'cause it was a
Mhm.
lot of changes, keeping kosher, keeping Shabbat. So it was challenging in the sense that we didn't have. It was difficult for my family, really, my parents in particular, because we were really changing the way we lived, and all of a sudden we weren't eating with them. We weren't
Mm.
um, like we would go to the cabin on the weekends, and it was hard to do Shabbat up there, and it was hard to tell the kids who were very young at the time, well, you can't go into the lake, and we can't do this and we can't do that. And
Mhm.
so it wasn't easy, I would put it that way. And yet we went ahead. I didn't change anything about myself. I didn't cover my hair. At one point I started to wear skirts, and then because everything really shifted into this more religious lifestyle, I I got very busy with that.
Mhm.
So I didn't have any outlets in Minnesota to perform, and that part of my life just was pushed away.
Mhm. What was inspiring to you about the religious lifestyle, the Jewish religious lifestyle that drew you there?
I remember being invited to a Shabbat meal with a family. They had also become religious, and their kids were teenagers, and everyone's sitting at the table. And their teenage son starts talking about Torah and current events. And I was so
Mm.
impressed, and I thought, wow, this is what I'd like to aspire to have
Mm.
kids who want to sit with you at the table, share a Shabbat meal, a special time, nobody's rushing. And that was just one of the motivating moments that I
Sure.
recall. Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. So, but you're this part of you, this performance part of you, this humorous part of you, the comedy part of you was kind of put on hold. For
Yeah.
how long was that put on hold until you realized you could really integrate it? Was it that you thought you couldn't, or you were just too busy with life?
I was busy with life. We were in Minnesota for about 7 years, and then we moved to Israel
Mhm.
for 4 years. Then we moved back to Minnesota for 2.5 years. Then we moved back to Israel.
Wow,
I
that's a lot
always
of
say
moving.
I've made Aliyah. I've moved to Israel 3 times. Really.
Wow.
There's a
Why did you move back and forth?
It was the first time because the plan was always to live here in Israel. And we wanted
Mhm,
to do it when my oldest son was going into first grade, which is Kita Aleph in Israel, which is really the beginning of the formal learning school year. So we did that. And then after 4 years, we had had 3 children. And my husband had a job opportunity, and I also needed support, and we'll get to that. And so we were there for a few years, but our goal really was to live here. And when
mhm,
we moved back in, it's been 13 years. At this point, we had 4 kids,
mm,
and I was in my early 40s at that point. And then the fifth came along.
mm,
So he doesn't know the youngest, who's going to be bar mitzvah in Rosh Hashanah, God willing. He doesn't know the back and forth, but my other kids do.
mm,
And so that was a challenge, but they're amazing. They rose to the challenge. Most of them are young adults now at this point. And it took me that long to feel like Israel was really home.
mhm,
But going back to your question about performing and putting it all on hold, like I said, I was just so busy trying
mhm,
to get used to the religious lifestyle and all of the moves. And I didn't know where I could do. I didn't even, I kind of lost myself actually. I'll
mhm.
put it that way. I lost myself.
You lost yourself, and what was that? I know you had some mental health challenges there,
Yeah.
like, along the way, which can you tell us about that? And was comedy and joy a way of reclaiming your I guess, your equilibrium?
So, yes, but it took a while to get there.
Mhm,
So, the first move to Israel was really difficult for me. I was postpartum. My daughter was only 5 months old. We had in this process of becoming religious, leaving my family. It was very, very stressful. And I just kind of went along with it because that was the plan. And I just had a very hard time adjusting. And I think it was the combo of the postpartum and the major life change.
of
I mean,
course, so much going on.
yeah,
Yes,
we're talking like 3 major life changes:
of
moving
course.
country, having a baby, and changing lifestyle, right?
Right.
And it wasn't something I was so familiar with. It was new, and it took
Mhm,
me a long time until it took me actually about 4 years until I realized that I was suffering from clinical depression.
mhm,
And it was something actually that some family members had sniffed out because it's not an unfamiliar challenge in my greater family.
mhm.
And yeah, it was sobering to find out that that's what was going on with me, and I really
Wow.
did suffer for years, and also with anxiety, but the main thing was depression.
Mhm. And how did you navigate that?
um, Through therapy, um, through knowing who was there to support me, family members, who not only supported me, but also my family, my children, eventually medication. And that was very hard for me to start because when the second time we had moved back to the States, I was working on some books that were more Breslev, which is a different Hasidus in the Jewish world. And a lot of it is focused on what's called hitbodedut, which is going out, let's say, to the fields and just having open conversations with Hashem, with God. And when I was doing this, I was also working on books that were really encouraging people to look at everything in their lives as if it comes from God. So I was very much in this frame of mind. and yet I'm suffering from depression. And
Mm,
I'm not saying that the information I was getting was necessarily unhealthy, but the way I was interpreting it was
mhm,
unhealthy. So I was feeling guilty. Like,
mm,
how can I be a God-fearing Jew? How can I be a religious woman and suffer from depression?
mm.
So I really made it hard for myself. And when I did first go to a psychiatrist, and he said, I really think you should try medication at this point. I was a low functioning depressive person, which means there are two kinds. There's low functioning, there's high functioning. High functioning, you probably wouldn't be able to tell that they're depressed, they're
Mhm.
getting up, they're going to work, doing everything they need, and then they come home and crash. Low functioning, which is what I had, I could barely get out of bed in the
Mm.
morning. And just even going to the grocery store was a huge chore. And I just remember going into the aisles and looking at all the pasta selections and just feeling overwhelmed.
Wow. Wow.
When I got the medication, I had it for about 2 weeks. And then finally I was like, I gotta take it. So I
Mm.
actually found that there's a prayer that we have in Judaism that you can say before you take a medication. And I said that prayer and I took it. Now, I wish I could end the story with that was it. That was the magic bullet. I was
Mm.
cured. That's it. Not so easy, but taking the medication and getting proper support did help. And I'll tell you something, probably about a month or so after taking the medication, I was dancing in the kitchen with my kids. And my son looked at me and he said, Mom, you're back.
Wow. Wow. It's interesting because I think there's so much guilt, like you mentioned that guilt that you felt like, "How could I be a God-fearing woman who's depressed?" There's so much blame, but it's really there's what do you say about that? What do you say to people who feel all that blame and self-incrimination?
So that is something I think somebody with depression is just doing already, is a lot of
Mhm,
self-blame, a lot of self-hatred, all of the negative things. One of the things that I do tell people who are dealing with somebody, a loved one, a friend who has depression, is don't tell them what they already know,
mhm,
meaning like, get up, get out of bed, pushing them in that way because there's already so much sort of self-disgust going on. Like, I hated the
mhm,
fact that I was in bed, but on the other
mhm.
hand, getting out was hard. It was really hard. So it was just this constant battle within that I think people with clinical depression have. And it took a long time for me to really like put that all aside, forgive myself, and love myself for all of my shortcomings and what have you.
And did your was your faith a support for you in any way? Or, once you started with the medication and once you started to feel a little bit better, was your faith and your conviction in God, did that serve as any kind of support system for you?
I would say eventually. In the beginning, it was more a source of guilt for me,
Mhm,
and then things shifted because even if I went to when we lived in the States, when I went to even a non-Jewish therapist, they saw how much God was a part of my world, and they brought
mhm,
they brought God in, and it was
mhm,
helpful because I think I went from the punishment, like, this is a punishment and I should
mhm,
know better and I should get
mhm,
over this, to this is just something that I need to, it's just one of the things that I'm dealing with. So many people deal with so many other things. And then really when we moved back to Israel, things shifted a lot because I was psychotherapy, I really felt like could only get me so far, but I needed something a little more hands-on.
mhm,
And I started therapy really digging deeper into visualization of what, let's say, my anxiety felt like, what it looked like, taking me in a way out of my head, out of the assumptions that I had. I did CBT, which is very helpful. That's cognitive behavioral therapy, where
Mhm.
it's so typical to catastrophize things
Mhm.
or to look at things in black and white. Also, learning that our thoughts are not necessarily reality,
Mhm.
and and kind of putting a lot of perfectionism aside. I think I
Mhm.
had a lot of expectations of myself that if I didn't live up to them, then I was a failure.
Right. Right. That self-critic that's inside of us that really takes over, that
Right.
we may think is positive, but is really just the opposite of anything holy or positive. Right. Wow.
I want to add that we're going to bring the funny back in because a big part of my healing
Mhm.
was when I became a medical clown.
Well, I was just gonna ask you that, like,
Yeah,
did the comedy and the comic help you? Go ahead. What
yes,
happened?
it definitely did. So, as I told you, I hadn't performed, done anything like that for 20 years. Professionally, I was a writer, I was an editor, also book editor. So, I was really good, also public relations. I was good at making other people look good, like cleaning up their
Mhm.
words and quoting them, but I didn't put myself out there. And when I was pregnant with my last child, at this point, we're living in Israel. I know it's a little confusing with the back and forth. We're living in Israel. I was at the end of my pregnancy. I was already feeling very bogged down. Again, a lot of changes. We just moved back. I was having a child again. And I was driving behind a bus, a city bus, and there was a billboard on the back of the bus for medical clowning.
Hmm.
There's a picture of a clown with a red nose, like a woman looking happy, and I just something clicked. I was like, "Well, that looks interesting." And after I had the baby, when he was a little bit older, I looked into it. There was a course for 5 months, and I signed up. I said, "I don't know what to expect." And I remember telling the instructor, "I think I can get the clown part down. The medical part, I'm not so sure."
Right.
And she said, "Don't worry, we'll train you." And it was one of the best things I ever did. So, what's a medical clown? Somebody who is trained to go into situations where there's a population at risk, whether it be a hospital, a nursing home, special needs school, battered women's shelter. And we do go in as a clown, hopefully not a scary clown, but we develop our own clown persona and we take it to people and it just helps them. Okay, let's just put it this way: somebody's in the hospital, nobody wants to be in the hospital,
Mhm.
and they're there because there's an issue, they need medical help, and it's depressing. And then somebody like a medical clown will come along, and always the medical clown, we're not just jumping in and like, whether you like it or not, here's your clown. Check with
Right.
the person. Are they open to it? And then we come in and we bring like kind of play and fun into magic tricks, gibberish. There are all kinds of ways to, I guess, communicate with people. Doesn't have to be for very long. Sometimes I would be with someone just for a few minutes, and sometimes it would be up to a half an hour. It really depended. But what it did for me is,
Mm.
even though I was struggling inside, it allowed me to step out of myself as Julie
Mm.
into my persona, who was Funny the clown. I was a
Mm.
4-year-old clown with pink hair,
Mm.
and I had a puppet, and it was magical.
It's so fascinating because here you're you're saying 2 things. You're really stepping into such a serious situation, a situation which is such a critical situation, and you're bringing the lightness, the humor into it, like a hospital or any of these places that you mentioned. So it's interesting that we can take 2 extremes. You're bringing the joy and the light playfulness into this serious situation, and how it also changed you from this by introducing that light part. You kind of were fake it till you make it. You kind of, which is really what we say a lot about in Hasidus. Try to do something, try to be someone, try to step into that role, and then you become it, which is kind of a little bit what you're saying.
Yeah. Absolutely. I did it for 4 years. I was also a party clown, so people would hire me to do birthday parties, or I would go into like nursery schools and do parties for whatever holiday was coming up. But it was very fulfilling as a medical
Mm.
clown. I think,
Why
like,
did you
let's say,
feel it was so fulfilling? What about it was so fulfilling for you?
first of all, it was a relief to get out of my head.
Mhm.
It I'm talking about Israel. So I would go to Israel's largest hospital, which is near Tel Aviv, called Tel HaShomer, and I was in the outpatient burns clinic. So I'll just walk you through a typical day, what it would be like. I'd come in, and there was a playroom for the children waiting for their appointments to be seen by the doctor. These were kids who had been burn patients. They were inpatient, and now they were healed enough where they just had to come back and get their bandages changed, or just have doctor's visits. So I would meet them in the playroom and we would connect. And I have to tell you that there were a lot of Arabs in the hospital, and I don't speak Arabic, but
Mm.
I do speak really well the language of gibberish. So it's amazing how much you can communicate without speaking words. So that in and of itself was very entertaining. But let's say whether it was an Arab child, a religious Jewish child, a child who couldn't even speak Hebrew because they were from Russia, or a non-religious child. I mean, it didn't matter. I walked into that hospital, and I'm tall. I'm like 5'8", pink hair,
Mm.
makeup, a doll, like very colorful clothing, and everyone smiled at me. Everyone's happy to see a clown. Now, typically, I'm a religious woman. Nobody's going to smile at me, not an Arab. And it was just like everyone was it just brought light. It brought a light to that place. So let's say I'm connecting with the child and it's time for her appointment. So I would ask the parents, can I accompany you and your child into the office? And usually they said yes. So I would come in, and often what would happen is the child would be traumatized.
Mm.
Because they had an experience already that was very
Mhm.
negative and painful. And I would try to distract the child with my
Mhm.
puppet or with magic tricks. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And I can tell you one story that was like, I think it's the one that stands out the most. There was a little Arab boy, he was in a wheelchair. Maybe he was 5 or 6 years old. His mother was with him, and I went to the doctor's office with them, and they picked him up out of the chair, and he had like stumps for legs. It's the first time I
Mhm.
really realized he didn't have legs. So they put him on the table, and the doctor started to undo his bandages, and he's screaming and crying. And his mother was sort of crouched down, and she was holding his, her arms, like just kind of like this, wasn't looking, but like holding him. And I'm like, what do I do? I don't speak Arabic.
Mhm.
I'm trying every magic trick I can. I'm taking out all the little prizes, and I don't know what to do. And I just started to sing.
Hmm.
He didn't stop crying, but I just remember as soon as they bandaged him up and picked him up, he was like, I'm done. He was fine.
Really?
And then he points to my bag, and I'm like, take all the prizes. Here you go.
Right.
After that experience, I called my teacher, and she said, no, that's really all you could have done. And I think that's something I learned about being a medical clown, is not to always take things personally.
Mhm.
So, for example, if we are to approach a patient and they don't want a clown at all, like go away,
Mhm.
and that will
Right.
happen.
Mhm.
It could be that they just got a difficult diagnosis. It could be that they're in too much pain. It doesn't always have to do with us.
Right. Right. That's
That was
that's
a
a good
very
lesson for
important
life.
lesson. Yeah,
That's an
yeah,
important life
exactly.
lesson. Wow. Wow, I think it's brilliant, whoever came up with this whole medic clown, idea of just bringing into such a serious situation the humor
So
and the
it's an
joy.
American. His name
Mhm,
is Dr. Patch Adams. There's actually a
mhm,
movie with Robin Williams.
mm,
And right when I signed up for the class, actually, I saw the movie. It was
mhm,
just beautiful. And he was a doctor who had his own mental health problems. Had been very depressed, I think even institutionalized. And he saw that when he incorporated play
Mm-hmm.
into care, that the patients healed faster. They received the care better. I mean, it's incredible the power of laughter in our lives. And
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it firsthand.
Incredible. And it brought more laughter into your life when you started doing this?
It did. I mean, it didn't mean that I didn't go home and still suffer with my own demons.
Mhm. Mhm.
But afterward, when I processed what I'd see, I saw kids with scars, with missing limbs. I mean, these kids had been through the ringer. It definitely put life in perspective. But it also showed me that as much as they had physical scars, I had scars as well, which were just as
Mhm.
legitimate. But we were
Mhm.
both healing. They were healing from their physical wounds, and I was also healing from my emotional wounds. And at that point, I also started to get involved with women's English speaking theater here in
Mhm.
Israel. And I started to do musicals, and I'm always cast as a man, which is
Really?
actually kind of fitting. I mean, in women's,
Right.
musical theater situations, because my parents were convinced I was going to be a boy.
Oh, okay.
Like, my mother they called me Butch when I was,
Uh-huh.
in my mother's womb, and my name was supposed to be Brian. So I don't know, maybe
Interesting.
there's this part of me that, you
A
know
masculine part, right?
yeah. I mean,
Interesting.
we all have the masculine, and we all have the
For
feminine.
sure.
I guess at
100%.
least in the theater world that,
Right.
it come out.
Right, wow. Well, I find it interesting because in Hasidic philosophy, joy has such a strong role. It could really help us with so many things, and really the hardest thing is depression and sadness. When you fall into sadness, that just stops you from really reaching who you are and what you are. So I find it intriguing that you use joy in your life in physical ailments as well as in an emotional ailments. So that's really,
Yes,
really
and
interesting.
it was a long road. Um,
Right.
it's been recurring. I wish I could
Mhm.
have said it was like this one-hit wonder and gone.
Mhm. Right.
But I recognize, and every time I would have a cycle, like a depressive cycle, and also, I was throughout life as women, we constantly have
Mhm.
changes in our life. So
Mhm.
it all really kicked in when I was postpartum, and
Mhm.
then it ebbed and flowed. And then
Mhm.
came perimenopause and then menopause, and like, Hashem, I know Chava, Eve took a bite from the apple, but, like, come on. So
Right. Right.
so with all of those changes that every woman goes through, when you have that extra baggage on top of you of mental health struggles, it's an extra challenge.
Of
But
course.
every time I had a cycle of depression, I knew how to get support.
That's
I got
important.
more tools for my toolbox,
Right.
and I think it was just also a part of acceptance. There's some people out there who struggle with high blood pressure. There are people out
Mhm.
there who struggle with diabetes. I was blessed with the mental health challenges. So,
Right. Right. We all have our struggles.
right.
Um, so I know, I know you're very active on social media and on Instagram. You have a large following with your very funny clips that you're always posting. You always make me laugh. Um, After October 7th in Israel, was there a time that you felt, I think you wrote this even, that you felt like it wasn't just appropriate to speak to act out these funny things when we're dealing with such a heavy atmosphere as a nation? What brought you out of that?
So I'll just give people a little bit of a background. So I became an accidental influencer. That's what we're called. I
Mm,
guess people on social media platforms who grow a following, who connect really with their audience. One way that we make a living really doing it is through brand sponsorships or what have you. So when I say accidental, I was doing stuff on Facebook. I was dressing up and doing impersonation videos in a group called Kol Isha, in a Facebook group. And it was a great outlet for me. I could just do it from my home, especially during Corona when we were all locked down. I was doing
mhm,
like parody videos, of songs, but with a Corona theme. And it was just a way for me to be creative. I wasn't going to the hospital anymore. I wasn't clowning. There was no women's theater. And then somebody said, why don't you open up an Instagram? And at the time I thought, why should I be on Instagram? Like, I'm not going to take pictures of my lunch and post it, like everybody on Instagram's doing. And then I did open an account. And then soon after, they rolled out something called Reels, which are like short video clips. And I started to do that. And all of a sudden, people started following me, and I'm having a great time.
Hmm.
I had an account that was shut down by Instagram. It wasn't an anti Semitic thing like you see these days, it was for other reasons. And then I started again about 2.5 years ago. And it was a blessing to start again because it helped me get very focused on what my niche is and what I want to do. And I
Hmm.
thought, I want to do more original comedy. I love creating characters. I live in Israel, which in and of itself is like you get all your material like without any effort. And it really went well. So what happened is leading up to I started my account in the summer of 2022, I believe. And then about a year later, a little over a year later, we had October 7th.
Hmm.
I was a medical clown, and you can try to bring humor, to somebody who's hospitalized, but how is this going to happen? This was too.
Mhm.
So I decided to just show people what life was like in my neighborhood, the chesed, like the acts of kindness that people were doing for the soldiers, making meals for them, doing their laundry. I'm in a neighborhood where there are a lot of schools. And some of the schools were kind of taken over by the army. All of a sudden, they had to train so many soldiers,
Hmm.
and they needed places to stay. So they're staying in schools, and they're like down the street. So you bring food and you help do their laundry. And you just felt October 7th, you felt incredibly helpless here.
Hmm.
What do we do other
Absolutely.
than pray, other than daven? You have to do something. You're going to go crazy.
Mhm.
And that's what I did. So I made content showing what life was like, and people really responded to that.
Hmm.
And then I would slip in little bits of silliness into that. For example, what a typical breakfast looks like today in Israel. So we would also have a lot of sirens, I'm actually recording in my safe room in my bomb shelter.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of time spent in here. A lot of trauma. And what did the typical breakfast look like? I take ice cream, and I have like a bottle of vodka, right? I mean, and it's dripping everywhere. And so
Right,
that was my way of coping.
right. So you're kind of poking fun at the reality of the situation
Right.
without, disregarding it, but kind of poking fun at what we're all going through and finding
Absolutely.
some humor in it. Right. Wow. Can you tell us a little about you have a lot of different characters that you do on your page. Can you tell us a little about some of the characters or maybe even show us how you do one of them?
Mm, perhaps. Okay, so
That'd be a
first
treat.
I'll tell you, I have, so there are two main characters that I created. One is a male character named Shaul, the Israeli taxi driver.
Mm,
And that is really based on my experience of living here in Israel, which is obviously very culturally different from the United States. Again, I grew up in Minnesota, which is Midwest, which is like a total opposite of Israel as far as just the pace of life and the stress levels. And there's so many things that can be so frustrating about living here because of the cultural differences, but you can take those challenges and just make them funny. I mean, they
mhm,
can be pretty ridiculous. And if you look at life in general, but especially here in Israel, with like a little bit of a twist, you can see
mhm,
that, for example, standing in line at a grocery store, okay? Often people will appear out of nowhere that they were there before you, but they just had to run and grab something. Or let's say they put a pack of tuna and a bottle of milk or something down in front of you, and then they went to go continue their shopping. but
Right.
they were there before you, so there are a lot of these types of things that would not happen in the States, and
Mm.
I just have to laugh because what am I
Right.
gonna do, get mad at them? So Shell was created based on a character that I actually played in a women's musical, and one of his like loves in life is what's called shoko basakit, which is chocolate milk in the bag, which is
Mm.
very unique to Israel.
Mm.
And why did I have him with shoko basakit? So when we moved here to Israel, okay, got married to an Israeli. We moved to Minnesota. We got his master's degree. We had 3 kids. We moved back to Israel. So when that happened, we took a nefesh b'nefesh flight because the kids were like, everybody had different statuses. I won't get into it, but we were on a nefesh b'nefesh. Nefesh b'nefesh is an organization that helps American and Canadian Jews make Aliyah, move to Israel.
Mhm.
So we're on this chartered flight, and the woman sitting next to me was making Aliyah with her family. And she goes back to use the bathroom. And she had some Hebrew because her parents were Israeli. And the flight attendant says to her, "Oh, life is so hard there." And
Mm.
she said, "But at least we have shoko basakit. At least we have chocolate milk in the bag. That's like the best part of living in Israel." So I'm like, I got to do something with this. So that's
Wow.
Shmuel, and he is just his dream is to live in New York, but they don't have shoko basakit in New York, so he's stuck here in Israel.
Right.
Now I have another character named Jolene Rachel. And
Mm.
Jolene Rachel, I actually created with my mom. And because I am a Balat Tshuva, which means somebody who became religious, I wanted to take that experience, but I put it in like a kind of a hillbilly,
Mm.
a
Right.
hillbilly Balat Tshuva, like newly religious. So, should I introduce you to Jolene?
We love it. I love Jolene, so for sure.
Oh, hi there, Mama. It's Jolene Ruffle. Well, I'm doing just fine, Mama. I'm actually doing a podcast right now. I know. It's so interesting because I'm getting asked so many questions about my life. And as you know, Mama, I now live in Israel. I made Aliyah. And sometimes I feel like, the porch lights on, but nobody's home. Because I don't understand what they're saying, and they barely understand me. Anyway, that's Jolene.
It's hysterical. I
And
love her. Love her character.
thank
Uh,
you.
do you get
Jolene.
any what kind of feedback do you get about Jolene?
So Jolene is really a character that kind of I call my followers Bobolas. So my like diehard Bobolas really like the Jolene character. Um, and some I've had a few people, like actually one woman in particular who is from the South, felt like I was really taking this too far and that's not how we talk. And I was like, this is just a caricature. I did not grow up in the South. I grew up in the Midwest. I don't even know what
Right.
accent I'm doing. But I really relate to Jolene because when when I became religious, I just so much was so new. Like, I don't,
Mm,
how am I supposed to know that you wash your hands for bread and you can't talk, or
mm,
um, you can't operate the electricity. I mean, it took about a year until I figured out how to keep Shabbat. So I really relate to Jolene, and I wanted to do it in a very exaggerated, silly kind of way. And I did have my character make Aliyah, so she's now here in Israel, and I'll have future content on how she's navigating life here.
right. So
So
what what
those are
what
really
message would you like to tell to Jolene's out there who are going through, a change in life, whether it's becoming more religious or any kind of change in life that they're dealing with and how to cope with the challenges?
do you want
How
me
to
to
find it
respond as Jolene or as Julie?
however you'd like.
Well, I think Jolene would say, um, Living here in Israel is kind of like it's as tough as old Joe Goss down the street here with his hogs. But you know what? Everything in life is hard, and as my mama says, we got to sometimes chin up and buck up, and dag nabbit, we just got to grab the bull by the horns and ride it. Okay, that would have been Jolene Russell. Julie, on the other hand, would not say that. I would say that ride the wave. It's not always going to be like this. And I think this is something that really helped me in general, being in a depressive cycle, is that life as we know it right now doesn't mean that it's going to be life as we know it, as we
Mhm,
don't know it really
mhm,
down the road. So this
mhm,
this will pass.
mhm,
And it's so easy when being in a down, depressive, however you want to put it, state, to forget what it's like when you felt joy.
mhm,
Um, but it will be there and it will come back, and
mhm,
get all the support you can. One thing I cannot stand is the martyr complex, when people feel like
mhm.
they have to work on their own, suffer on their own, everything they know is the right way. No, we are here for each other, we need each other. Hashem,
100%.
God did not put us in this world to be alone.
Mm. That's very true. And how do you think that people could add more joy into their life? Like, you obviously do it with comedy, and that plays a big role. What if someone is not so humorous like you? How can they add a little bit of joy into their life?
um, I think it's really important to know what does bring joy, and it
Mhm,
doesn't have to be a big thing.
mhm,
And I'll bring back being in depression again, because when I was at one of my lowest points, I remember my therapist said, just do one thing a day that brings you joy, even if
mhm,
it's eating an ice cream cone.
mhm,
I think that if somebody isn't sure, then it's really worth exploring, because life can be hard and challenging, but that's not the purpose of what we're here for. We're here
mhm,
to also enjoy it. So
mhm,
start little, whether it is, comedy is amazing, just going to a show, even watching on social media, online, on YouTube. We have so many resources available. And when I actually was teaching medical clowning workshops to people, how to incorporate um, joy into your life, you can take any everyday situation and just spin it a little bit. I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a kid who has a temper tantrum and they're like full blown out on the floor, kicking and screaming and crying. More than once, I've gotten down on the floor with them and done the same thing. Okay,
mm,
I
mm.
will say it's at home. I never did that
Right.
in front before.
Right.
It's amazing. All of a sudden, like, my
Great,
son
yes.
looked at me like, "What? That's my job." But
Right,
it shifted something. Get some wigs.
right. That's a great
Purim is our day of dress up and being silly, but we don't have to wait for Purim.
right, 100%. What I'm also finding so fascinating is, here you're doing this, like, this isn't what people think of as a typical Orthodox Hasidic woman, Jewish woman, who is just taking these roles, but you're really showing how you could integrate everything really into being a Jewish woman, an observant Jewish woman, and doing it in a kosher way, finding the kosher comedy, doing it in a way with all women productions. I find that very liberating.
Yeah. My I go by Julie Shtick, and I love the word shtick. For those who don't know it, it's a Yiddish word which means kind of like a comic act or routine. And I just feel like people need more shtick in their lives.
Mm,
The world is so heavy, and especially for
right.
those of us on social media, or if we're constantly bombarded with news, and it's not the news, it's the bad news.
Mhm.
And we're not built for this. We're not built to know about everything that goes on in the world. And it's just, especially since October 7th, so overwhelmingly heavy.
Mhm.
Um, we need shtick.
Mm,
We need shtick like we need breath.
100%. We need to reclaim the joy in our lives. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jinx.
Uh, one last question. Is there any favorite teaching, Torah teaching, that you could share with us that you bring out of your toolbox when you need to feel that happiness or joy?
That's a great question. Um, I will be the first to admit that I do feel like I have a lot of, and I know you're not going there, but I want to say that I don't, I don't have a lot of formal training as far
Mhm.
as being a religious Jew. I've gone to like classes here and there, but I didn't go to seminary. I didn't like. I still feel like at the Shabbat table, I'm asking very basic questions, and that's fine.
Mhm.
But as far as quoting, it's hard to think of something. But I'll tell you concepts that I really take with me. One is Ahavat Yisrael,
Mhm.
which is loving your fellow as yourself, which is I
But
think
you could only do Jolene if you love everybody, right?
right, right. But it's actually kind of sobering because as somebody who has suffered from depression,
Mhm.
not loving myself, you can't
Mhm.
truly show love for somebody unless you do love yourself.
Right.
And so that's been something. There's also a quote. It's funny, it's on my computer, so I don't want to mess it up. But Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor and an author, and he wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning.
Mhm.
And I really don't want to butcher his quote, but it's something to do with I would have never survived if I could not have laughed.
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
what he's basically saying is laughter took him out of his darkness, even in the Holocaust.
Mhm.
So, with everything that's going on in the world, with the rising anti Semitism, with what we're living through, these what we're living through even today, um, it's very dark. And
Mhm.
it's a very Hasidic thing, but it takes one light, right? It takes one light to light up the darkness. And we all have that
100%.
light within ourselves.
Mhm.
For
That's a
me,
beautiful.
it took me until I was in my like early 50s to see my light.
Wow. Wow. Incredible. Well, we're so happy that you found your light and that you're sharing your light with the world. And may you continue to go on and bring smiles and happiness to people's lives, people's faces, because you're doing amazing work. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, darling.
Thank you for joining us, Jolene and Julie.
There you go.
Thank you. Wow, Julie Rothschild Levy, what an interesting personality. So many things that have gone through, she has gone through in her life, so many changes back and forth to Israel. I found it very interesting how she uses comedy and joy to help her, to help others, how she came as a medicomic to the hospital or to places where people were in such critical situations and brought the joy. And it just made me feel that this is what we can do in our own lives as well, even when we're going through a time of darkness, a time of hardship, to somehow find that little glimmer of joy, that little glimmer of hope, that joyfulness, that stickiness, as Julie calls it. And she does it with all her different characters. I found it so interesting to see that she has so many different characters because there's so many different parts to her. And unfortunately, it took her so many years till she actually was able to find it. But I think the world is better because she has found that light within her. I loved her impersonation at the end, but I really think that that message that she brought for all of us is to find that joy in our own life in whatever area we can, to whether it be through funny comedy or stickiness as she calls it, or dressing up as different people, or just doing something that makes us realize that our situation, whatever we're going through, our circumstances might not be as bleak as we feel, or even if it is as bleak as we feel, there still is a glimmer of light and hope and joy that we can bring to it. If you enjoy watching these interviews, I hope you are subscribed to Chabad.org/extraordinary. Find us on all platforms that have any kind of podcast. We're there. Find us on YouTube as well. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for being part of this extraordinary community.